Hello everyone, Dr. Shabazz here, and we're going to be doing a video on Chapter 4 today. This past week we started Chapter 4 and we were discussing economic systems, we were discussing classification of nations, and we reviewed a couple of articles that were written by college students some years ago, including a friend of mine who I met while I was in Egypt. This information that I'm going to share with you on today is information that you may not get anywhere else. The type of information that I'll give you would be information that you would have to get in a course like international relations, economic development, international trade, some economic geography classes that also have these types of this type of content. And so while I admit that some of the information and theories that I'm going to present to you are outside the scope of the course, I think it's absolutely vital for you to have an understanding of not only economic development and economic systems, but how this whole international economic trading system has evolved over time. It's really very fascinating, the history of how this evolved, and I have some video clips that I think you will find very interesting. So today I'm going to be talking about economic development of nations, and this past week we reviewed a couple of articles that were written by college students, and one of them was a friend of mine, Dr. Jean Renoir Eugene. And I met him while we were in Egypt, and we developed a very close relationship in those 17 days. I never saw him again in my life, but we would correspond, and he sent me a couple of articles. One that he wrote in response to an article that was written. So let's talk about the world system. Dr. Eugene mentioned Immanuel Wallerstein, which before I met Eugene, I did not know who Immanuel Wallerstein was. He was a theorist that talked about the world being divided into segments. And during slavery and colonialism, you had a situation where particularly European nations looked at parts of the world as vessels of resources. One of those regions of the world happened to have been Africa. Africa is very replete in mineral wealth, agricultural wealth, and human resources as well. Although the continent is not overpopulated, it's actually underpopulated, it has a wealth of every resource imaginable. So if you look at this map, you can see what was at stake when this scramble for Africa started. You can see that there's uranium, oil, gold, coffee. So you have commodities and you have mineral wealth, and then you also have the commodities like coffee, all types of grains, diamond, gold, iron ore, everything that you need to run an industrial complex. So this knowledge, or knowledge of the wealth of Africa, resulted in Europe coming in, conquering the continent, and then having the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, where 14 European nations got together to begin dividing up the continent as it was a piece of cake. Competition was fierce for the raw materials, and certain trades were proposed. And when I say trades, I don't mean of commodities. I mean trading countries. So you had situations where European nations were saying, I'll trade you this country for that country, because it gave them some kind of strategic position, where it might have been a port country that they wanted access to. So in Africa, there were a few countries that were not colonized, most notably Ethiopia, which was a country that was lauded as being a jewel of Africa because it was one of the only countries that resisted colonialism, and the Italians were the invaders, and the Ethiopians fought a war against the Italians, and the Italians failed to completely colonize the country of Ethiopia. You also had Morocco, Liberia, which was kind of an American colony that was created for freed American slaves. So you have these freed American slaves who actually resettled back in Liberia and created this settlement, which is very interesting. So you would go to Liberia and you would find names like Jones and Smith amongst the Africans. You also had South Africa that was not colonized because it was, as you may know, run by the white settler population of British and Dutch ancestry. So these are the nations that escaped the clutches of Europe. So this idea of Africa being this reservoir of resources began the downfall of the continent itself and disrupted the socio-economic system of the continent, divided groups, and really disturbed the cultural fabric of the continent. So in this video segment that I'm about to show you, it will begin talking about the onset of colonialism, and then I will then show you a segment about the resources that Europe were after. So let's take a look at the first segment. So this is from the video series Africa by Basil Davison. He was a British scholar, and he did an 8-part series on the continent. Very, very exhilarating, if I could use that word. It was shot in the 80s, and I remember watching it. It would come on once a week, I believe on Sunday night. And I was very young and impressionable, and it certainly gave me a wealth of knowledge. So here we go. This is the Magnificent African Cake, part 6 of the 8-part series.
The west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the black continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide.
So as you can see, that was a very informative piece of information. And it was that carve-up of Africa that represented the changing landscape, which is why the Europeans were competing over these different territories. And they drew these borders that you see today were drawn by the Europeans. And slavery had already existed up until the 19th century. But they abolished slavery not because of some humanitarian idea, but because they wanted to make greater use of the human resources that were on the continent. They needed human labor in order to harvest the raw materials to send back to Europe and to other countries that would benefit from that the extraction of those materials. So it was quite a dark period in Africa's history, but some interesting things occurred. Some interesting events occurred after colonialism took place. You had this war World War II that broke out. So there were some interesting events that took place after this conference to divide Africa up. You had governors that ruled these territories, and the governor would have underlings, African underlings, that would report to the governor. And they did things like set up taxation, so the local people of Africa had to pay taxes to the governor to do things such as making the roads that were going to be used to extract the materials out of the continent going into Europe. So the Africans had to pay taxes in their own country. But there was a war in the early 1900s that destabilized Europe, and then there was another one beginning in 1939 to 1945 that totally destroyed Europe. So during this period of colonialism, the Western nations had extracted materials to help the industrialization of their countries. World War II essentially wiped that away, destroyed these countries, and Europe was not strong enough at that point to continue to manage their possessions, their colonial possessions. And it was at this time that after the war, many Africans who fought in World War II for Europe thought that they were going to receive some benefits, that they were going to be able to run their own affairs. And Europe at that time was not in a hurry to afford them independence. And so then you had a series of revolutionary movements that started to sprout up in Africa, and many of these revolutionary organizations fought for independence, and Ghana was the first country in 1957 to win its independence as from England, and it was the first sub-Saharan African nation to do so. In the 1960s, there was a wave of independence that swept the continent, also including countries like Nigeria, which in 1960, October 1st, gained their independence from England. Most of the French-speaking African nations remained tied to France, but they were also awarded independence in the early 60s. Portugal, which was one of the countries that held on to their colonial territories, ended up losing wars against revolutionary movements, and Mozambique and Angola earned their independence in 1975. So this next segment will talk about what was at stake and how this system was actually set up. And this was the era of, again, specialization, where you had countries that were colonized, and the purpose of the colonization was for raw materials. So these countries were set up to provide raw materials to Europe, and most of their exports would come in the form of this one resource. So what you had here was a situation where European nations used these colonies to specialize in certain commodities. And these commodities would then be shipped back to Europe and then would be made into other finished products. So for an example, we'll see the case of Ghana and cocoa. That cocoa being sent back to Europe, and then that cocoa being made into chocolate, which obviously had a big market in Western Europe and also the United States. So we'll begin to see how this whole economic system was laid out in Africa at the time.
The cash crop era got into its stride. Groundnuts, as here in Senegal, were a crop that brought cash to farmers and to colonial purchasing companies. But the cash crop's success also brought problems.
Il est certain que l'arachide a été introduite pour alimenter tout simplement la monoculture de l'arachide a été introduite pour des raisons industrielles, ni plus ni moins. Hein, c'est en 1848, je crois, que des Marseillais l'ont introduite ici pour fabriquer tout simplement de l'huile pour vendre ça sur le marché international. Et on a spécialisé finalement, la tendance est née de spécialiser chaque colonie en fonction de ce qu'elle pouvait produire le mieux. Et on a donc toutes les zones sahéliennes ont été spécialisées pour la culture de l'arachide, des zones comme la Guinée pour la culture de la banane et le riz, et ainsi de suite. Mais ça, c'était en fonction, non pas des intérêts locaux des indigènes, de ceux qui habitaient ces terres-là, mais en fonction des besoins en matières premières des usines qui tournaient à Marseille, à Bordeaux et en Europe d'une façon générale.
So long as their crops were bought, African growers could be reasonably content. But in 1929, there began the huge and long disaster of the World Depression, and prices collapsed. Food production for local people, already badly hit because of land taken for cash crops, became a subject of major crisis. What was true of the French Empire was just as true of all the others. Here in the Gold Coast, the big cash crop was cocoa, providing the bulk of the colony's exports. The crop was grown and harvested entirely by African farmers who had to sell it to British and other foreign buying companies. These companies banded together so as to pay the farmers an artificially low price. The farmers of Ghana, then the Gold Coast, nonetheless worked so well that they became the world's biggest producers of cocoa, and so of chocolate, which Africans didn't eat. But the gains were far from equally shared. The Ghanaian historian, Professor Edo Boahen.
There's no doubt at all that the farmers were being cheated. The prices that were being paid for the cocoa bore no relationship to the prices that they had to pay for the imported goods. We had no say in the pricing of our own commodities. We had no say in what we paid for what was imported. This was, in fact, one of the greatest indictments against the colonial economic policies, the fact that so much emphasis was placed on a single cash crop. And we had to import rice, we had to import oil, palm, oil, and so on, to feed ourselves, because so much emphasis and so much attention was paid to this single cash crop cocoa. The colonial governments were just concerned with obtaining raw materials to feed their factories abroad.
So there you have the idea that Africa, which I'm using as a case study, was carved up in the Berlin Conference precisely for the reason of raw materials, so that these raw materials could be sent back to European factories, which included African workers that migrated to Europe. For them, it was a better way of life. They were able to earn money for their labor, and they were able to contribute to the building of this manufacturing system. These products would then be exported to other countries, America, Asia, and even Africa, with a value-added price, which meant that if you imported cocoa from Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, you may use about 3 cents worth of cocoa, and then you would make a chocolate bar, and you would sell that chocolate bar abroad for $2, $3, $4. Today, some chocolate bars are even $5 for the real rich kind. And it's just a huge markup. So this represents this gap, this increasing gap between developed nations, industrial nations, and then developing nations which provided the raw materials. So you have this classification and this increasing gap in the terms of trade, where Africans had to import all these finished goods because they were so focused on producing cash crops, agricultural products, that they could not focus on making their own type of goods. They had to import everything from Europe and from the United States in order to gain a standard of living that was reasonable. So in the previous segment, you saw a couple of examples where African nations and their resources were used to fuel the production supply chain for European countries. You saw groundnuts, which we call peanuts. You saw cocoa, which obviously is used to make chocolates. Very big market for chocolates. All the other raw materials that you saw in an earlier slide, where you had the African continent and you had the borders drawn and all these resources, you had oil, you had copper, diamonds, bauxite, gold, agricultural products, all types of commodities were used for export so that Europe can convert those into hundreds and perhaps thousands of different products. And this actually helped Europe to rebuild very quickly. And so Africa was at the mercy of Europe in many different ways. Of course, it had been colonized for 300 years and had been extracting materials from the continent since that time. And they had set a system where African nations would be set up to produce one specific raw material. You saw the scholar Sheikh Anta Diop talk about this idea of specialization, where one country focuses on cocoa, one focuses on coffee, one focuses on copper. So the entire infrastructure that was created by Europe, the roads, the railroads, the bridges, the ports, and everything else that supported the moving of materials from Africa to Europe was built not with the idea that they were going to create something for the Africans to benefit, but only for the Europeans and the economy of Europe. So thus you had this international division of labor that was created, where you had the center nations or the core nations, which were represented by European industrial countries, on the this entire industrial revolution that was taking place. So this injection of resources fueled that in the center. The periphery only supplied them with the inputs, creating this division of labor. So World War II came. Of course, World War I in the early part of the 20th century created a lot of discord in the region. But it was World War II that really had an impact because it was widespread and it touched and destroyed not only the infrastructure, but it destroyed economies. So during the war, Africans participated as colonial subjects to European countries, and they fought in World War II. They fought valiantly to overthrow fascism. And they thought that they would receive some type of consideration for their independence.
The Second World War and tens of thousands of young Africans were drafted overseas. The conflict was never really theirs, but for the first time they saw the conditions of their subjugated countries from the outside. They played their part in the winning of great victories, not least in Burma. In 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt issued the famous Atlantic Charter, their grand promise that after the war, we shall respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Africa's returning soldiers heard this pledge, and it raised high hopes.
The promises they had before the war, that after the war, some of them will be given better jobs and better pay, good money and so on, all the rest of it, and they had nothing.
The aura of superiority which had been there all along was destroyed by that war, at least for those soldiers who fought side by side with whites. Thereafter, on their return home, nobody could expect them to regard the white man as some little god. He was human, he had his weaknesses, he had his fears, and so on.
When peace came in 1945, nothing in the colonial landscape seemed different from before. Yet beneath the apparent calm, strong political pressures were building up. Even in remote rural areas, the message for a different future began to be heard. As well as the returning soldiers and their newfound aspirations, the seething expansion of many colonial towns, often 2 or 3 times bigger than before the war, also gave Africa's political leaders a mass audience for the first time. The struggle for independence moved firmly into the streets. Even the slow growth of primary education, wherever that occurred in some British, French and Belgian colonies, began to have a liberating influence. And that influence was carried further by young Africans now studying overseas.
Ils sont, virgule, tout, virgule, étonnés.
Up and down the country, you meet them everywhere. Men and women from the British colonies, working with us, learning from us. Nowadays, they and we share a common citizenship, but today we also share with them a common purpose, a partnership in progress and prosperity for us both. To us in the factory at home, this plan for mutual exchange may seem remote, but we are, every one of us, a part of it. For if the colonies are to send us the food and raw materials we're short of, we must send them the tools to do the job. We shan't complete so great a task overnight, but from every piece of equipment we can send to the colonies now, we stand to share the benefit ourselves in the future.
Looking back, one may well marvel at the complacency of the men who ruled the colonies from the tranquil corridors of Westminster and Whitehall. They saw no need to allow for any major political change, except in Britain's 4 West African colonies. And even there, the rulers wanted to move very slowly. Indeed, these worthy men deceived themselves, and their awakening to reality came from where it was least expected.
So as you can see, after World War II, many Africans were sent overseas for schooling, for university studies, and it was expected that they would help provide some of the labor that was needed to help with the rebuilding of Europe, but also to maintain that relationship that existed between Europe and Africa. It's interesting to note that this idea of the rebuilding of Europe came as America rose to its prominence. As Europe was rebuilding, the World Bank and the IMF were organizations that were created prior to the end of the war in 1944 to provide financial stability to the economic trading system. America's dollar would serve as the backbone of this system. The United Nations would keep peace, as the Charter of the UN, which was signed in 1945, stated. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs would be the trade referee, and it would resolve any disputes between nations and also monitor tariff and non-tariff barriers. So thus you had this system that was created, and after World War II, you had the relationship between Europe and many of the other territories remained the same. But in Africa, Africa was the engine, Africa was the catalyst because it had the resources that Europe needed to fuel its growth. Many Africans thought that after the war, they would receive some consideration to manage their own affairs and chart their own course in history. And they had great ambitions to do so. Many of them were newly educated and had earned degrees from abroad and thought that they were ready to take on that task. However, Europe did not seem ready for that transition. Meantime, other nations, developing nations, began to meet, have these alliances. They had a conference in Indonesia called the Afro-Asian Conference, also known as the Bandung Conference, in 1955, where they got together and they talked about collaboration between African and Asian nations. They also talked about this idea of colonialism, of how these nations were going to throw off the yoke of colonialism. They talked about the relationship with the Soviet Union, because at that time you had a war, an ideological war that was brewing between the United States and the Soviet Union. So they discussed all of these matters. But this conference, as well as many others, became it became kind of a platform for this idea of independence and independence movements around the developing world. So this conference, this Bandung Conference of 1955, served as a motivation for countries in Africa and Asia to chart their own course in history, and fueled a number of revolutionary movements and gave birth to what's called the non-aligned movement. So with this revolutionary fervor now having bubbled to the surface, we saw a number of movements that took place, one of which sprouted in Ghana, West Africa, formerly called the Gold Coast, and that nation became the first to declare its independence as a sub-Saharan African nation. You had the rise of nationalism all throughout the continent of Africa. Is that this nation of Ghana would then serve as a model of success of what can be done by African leaders to throw off the yoke of colonialism. Dr. Nkrumah touted this idea of Pan-African unity, in which African leaders would combine their resources and serve as a powerful bloc against European exploitation, American exploitation, and even Soviet exploitation. And they went to fight armed resistance throughout the continent. You see a picture of Samora Machel, who fought for his party Frelimo against the Portuguese to free Mozambique, a country which became independent in 1975, which was one of the countries that waited a much longer time for its independence than Ghana, the French-speaking countries, Nigeria in 1960, most of the French-speaking countries, African countries, became independent in the early 60s. You had other countries that became independent later. The next clip is of Ghana's independence pronouncement by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, a very emotional time in the country's history, and in Independence Square, a place that you can visit to this day.
In 1957, the British duly completed their promise and the Gold Coast became the first colony south of the Sahara to win its independence. Nkrumah renamed the country after an ancient West African empire. He called it Ghana.
Ghana, Ghana is the name, Ghana. We wish to proclaim, we will be jolly, merry and gay, the 6th of March, Independence Day.
It was one of the truly memorable moments in Africa's recent history that I've been privileged to watch and witness. By winning independence, Nkrumah fired the imagination and raised the hopes of black people everywhere, not only in the Gold Coast, or Ghana as it now became, but throughout the black continent and even across the seas. They believed that Ghana's independence was going to be good news for them as well. And Nkrumah, for his part, was determined to prove them right.
At long last, the battle has ended. Your beloved country is free forever. Today, from now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. And we again rededicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it links up with total liberation of the African continent.
Nkrumah lost no time in proving that he meant just what he said, that Ghana must lead the way for the liberation of all the other colonies. He saw beyond nationalism. He saw it as a prelude in Africa to internationalism, to the building of a unity and freedom that should become continent-wide. In Ghana at this time was the future leader of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe.
His Pan-Africanist approach that Africa must be united, that the rest of Africa, which was still under colonial rule, must be freed. Those were very, very important ideas. And we continued even after I had quit teaching to travel to Ghana nearly on a yearly basis to hold conferences there and to get inspired by Kwame Nkrumah.
200 delegates to the All-African People's Conference heard a speech much to their liking by the Prime Minister of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah.
Fighters for African freedoms, I appeal to you in the sacred name of Mother Africa to leave this conference resolved to rededicate yourselves to the task of forming among the political parties in your respective countries a broad united front based upon one common fundamental aim and object, the speedy liberation of your territories. This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
So in this Declaration of Independence by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he talked about the unification of Africans, and he said that the independence of Ghana is meaningless until it is tied to the freedom of all the other African countries or the entire continent. And he went on to tout this idea of Pan-African unity. And there was uneven support as a result. You had many leaders, such as those who also were fighting for their independence, like Samora Machel, who's pictured here, who fought the battle against the Portuguese. His party, Frelimo, went into the bush to fight against the brutal regime of Portugal. And you had other leaders who fought. You had Azikiwe of Nigeria, who was a proponent of Nigerian nationalism. Nigeria would become independent in 1960. You had Patrice Lumumba, who was one of Nkrumah's contemporaries. Unfortunately for him, despite him being democratically elected, he had socialist leanings. He was overthrown by a colonel, and that colonel was supported by the United States as a proxy war against the Soviet Union, who was supporting Lumumba. Sékou Touré of Guinea, French-speaking West African country, actually welcomed Nkrumah after he was overthrown. While Nkrumah was overseas, a CIA orchestrated plot overthrew his government, and he went into exile into Guinea, where he ended up being declared co-president to Sékou Touré and disgracefully died in Romania in 1972. Amilcar Cabral was basically an agricultural specialist who went into armed resistance for Guinea-Bissau against the Portuguese. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania did something very interesting for the country in that he created this village of cooperative economics, and everyone had to learn this language of Swahili. So you had this very high literacy rate, and you had this vision to create this idea of cooperative economics for the country. I actually saw President Nyerere speak at Morehouse when I was a graduate student, and he spoke of the successes and the failures of Tanzania at the time. And you had others also in East Africa, such as Jomo Kenyatta, and fighting also against the Portuguese as part of the frontline states. You had Samora Machel, who is a brilliant commander in the field, and eventually threw off the yoke of colonialism from the Portuguese. Unfortunately, Machel was said to have been assassinated when the plane that he was traveling in from South Africa was shot down or crashed. Many suspected that it was shot down. So in all this, you had an idea of African unity that was being proposed by Dr. Nkrumah, which resulted in the Organization of African Unity in 1963 as a compromise of all of these different factions, some wanting the Pan-African unity, some wanting to stay tied to France, and then some wanting to remain independent and for the time being before becoming part of a larger body. Very interesting time for the African continent, and since then it is one that has been struggling for that direction in terms of sustainable growth and development in their respective countries. So also further with classifying countries, you have in those nations that represent the developed nations, you have three blocks. You have the North American bloc, the European bloc, and you have the Asian bloc, which is led by Japan. Also, throughout history, you've had a lot of these different, I guess you can say, geographic framework of how countries are, where their loyalties lie. You had the Cold War, where you had the Soviet Union versus the US, and you had other countries that were supporting one ideology versus the other. You had the North versus the South, the North nations being the industrial nations, and the Southern nations being those that were in Central America, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and some of the Pacific regions. You had the emerging markets, and you had the developing countries, which we've talked about, and then you had the economic indicators that determine where those countries would lie in that pecking order. So on page 110, they talk about purchasing power parity. This idea that you have a value of goods and services that can be purchased with 1 unit of a country's currency. Putting it in a slightly different way, it's looking at how much your money is worth in a particular country. If, for example, you buy 4 items in the United States and you buy those same 4 items in Bangladesh, how much do those goods cost in each country? If you do a comparative analysis of those 2 products, you may find that your money actually goes further in Bangladesh. You may be able to buy more items with the same amount of money. We've been talking a lot about economic strength and what constitutes a country's classification. And we can look at GDP, GDP per capita, and all of these different indicators, income distribution. But there's another indicator, Human Development Index, which looks at the social stability and the social health of a country. So we're talking about indicators such as education, healthcare, literacy, maternal mortality, infant mortality. All of these things represent a social welfare in terms of what is your standard of living in that country, because that also matters. Not just your GDP per capita, but also whether you have a decent standard of living. So this HDI, or this Human Development Index, gives an idea also of how countries are classified in terms of their stability, their social stability. So you have this HDI index on page 111. As you can see, Norway is at the top of this chart, which this is a 2013 chart. So in terms of its HDI value, it's at the very top, and Mozambique is at the very bottom. The US is number 3. So this gives you an idea of the standard of living that each of these countries are able to offer their citizens. So that's another classification. This idea of countries in transition, we think about countries that are now moving from agricultural emphasis to some industrial emphasis. And we look at countries like South Africa, we look at Brazil, we look at Russia, we look at India, we look at China. All of these countries are in transition. But on page 122, they mentioned China, and they talk about that evolution. And 126, they talk about Russia and their evolution as a country that's an emerging market. So this idea of development, countries developing, what does it mean? What does it mean to develop? Does it mean that you have an infrastructure like what you see on the right here? You have development models based on getting foreign aid. You have some models based on trade. So in some developing countries, it was to give foreign aid and to give a boost to their local economy by giving them money for things that they can do. So it was aid, not trade. And then it was trade, not aid, because countries were getting into debt. Now it's trade and aid. So you have these different development models to gauge a country's growth. So I mentioned growth. What is growth? Growth may be the increase in one of those indicators that I mentioned, GDP, GNP, GDP per capita. That does not necessarily mean that a country is developed, because you also have to look at the social indicators as well, as I mentioned, the HDI index. The picture that's on the right is a picture of Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. They rely heavily on tourism. They rely heavily on their trade relationships with Europe, most notably England. They provide exports of tea and coffee, and they're still developing this upward trajectory towards development. There is a fallacy of comparing countries, developing countries with developed countries. And there's a famous example that was used a lot in graduate school where they would compare South Korea with Ghana. And they said in 1960, Ghana and South Korea were at the same level. Now South Korea is an emerging market and Ghana is still a developing country. But you also have to look at the investment that these countries attracted. And South Korea attracted a lot of investment from the West, and they created these industrial sectors for outsourcing, basically manufacturing labor, until South Korea was at the point where they can develop their own industrial sector, and they were able to do that with a lot of outside investment. So there's a fallacy of comparison when you talk about comparing these developing nations who subsist on agricultural exports, mineral exports, with these countries that are able to create industrial goods. There's just no comparison here. But the question may be, how does a developing country get out of this dependence on these types of exports, which fluctuate in value and that are at the whim of market forces? Other developing regions, Latin America has had difficulties in terms of their political stability. The Caribbean has had trouble and have found themselves in a situation where many of their assets are now controlled by external forces. Here you have the country, Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda, showing elements of growth. Does it mean development? Well, perhaps, but Rwanda is still a very poor country, but they have shown signs of development. And so thus, I show the picture to also give an idea that African countries are not simply these dusty depictions that you see in the media. I mean, there's more to Africa than these World Vision commercials of babies with flies on their face. And this does not mean that this infrastructure should be what Africa should strive for. I mean, certainly tall buildings and infrastructure is good, but again, growth does not mean development, and you have to have an infrastructure that shows development in many different forms: economic, also social. Social development is also a part of that as well. So now we'll look at these international organizations and the role that they play. This will be the last segment. First, we'll look at the World Bank. As I said before, in this organization is covered in Chapter 1, that the World Bank was created in 1944 prior to the end of World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. So a group of nations, primarily European and America, came to Bretton Woods to decide on how to fix this financial system that had been destroyed by the war. The World Bank is headquartered in Washington, D.C. It's right down the street from the White House. And its original intention was to provide a resource for European nations as a way of rebuilding the countries. The US dollar was set as the central reserve asset, and it is still the backbone of the system. Later, the bank became synonymous with funding long-term development projects in the less fortunate nations or developing nations for projects like bridges, dams, roads, highways, power plants, and the like. On the other hand, the IMF was a entity that you would go to if you were in trouble. The original idea was to ensure the stability of international monetary system, exchange rates, international payments, and the idea that countries' transactions with each other had to be normalized. However, it does offer short-term loans for emergency funding with conditionalities that are usually in the form of structural adjustment programs. These programs were at a time notorious for giving bitter medicine to developing countries, such as devaluing currency, adjusting interest rates, cutting government spending, and in some regards made the situation a lot worse and made countries even more indebted, and through cutting social programs made the countries sicker. There have been some ideas of reform for the IMF, but it is still has a mixed record when it comes to providing sustenance and assistance to those countries that are in need. The United Nations was created after the charter was signed in 1945 as a peacekeeping body to avoid conflicts. It is headquartered in New York on international territory, which means that if you go to the United Nations, that land that you are standing on is not U.S. territory, it's actually international territory. So you have 6 branches of the United Nations, the Security Council being the most powerful with 5 permanent members. You have 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council making 15 members. The 5 permanent members are the actual winners of the World War II. The US, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. China and Russia were both on the side of the Allied powers during World War II, and so they also have veto power. You have the General Assembly, which consists of all the member nations. Every fall in September they get together and they present their positions in a debate. There are all types of conferences on many different issues. There are discussions on conflicts around the world. They pass resolutions. They come up with ways to quell many of the conflicts. And it is one of the influential bodies of the United Nations. But sometimes there's a lot of jockeying for position. You know, in the corridors, during the breaks, you have a lot of bargaining that's done. You know, for if you want to support somebody's proposal on the floor, then that may mean that you give concessions on trade. So there's a lot of these different plays that are made, diplomatic arrangements that are made in order to support these legislations that are brought before the body. So the Secretariat runs the operation of the United Nations, including the staffing of the translators, the specialists, the researchers, and all of those agencies that make up part of the United Nations. You have the World Court of Justice, which hears cases of internal conflict of countries, cases of mistreatment, discrimination, genocide are brought before the World Court of Justice, or if there are leaders that are deemed to be corrupt and to have committed atrocities, then these leaders can be brought before the World Court of Justice and be tried as a criminal. You have the Economic and Social Council, which is a body which provides all types of data on economic methods for improvement, and this can be information on agricultural methods. It can be information on microfinancing. It can be information on how to eradicate diseases, on how to improve an educational delivery system, hospital systems, and other methods of economic growth and social development. If you go to the United Nations, you can buy all types of reports on these studies that have been done and have been produced by the ECOSOC, or Economic and Social Council. The Trusteeship Council is a council that would become a guardian over a nation that does not have a functioning government. There are no such countries that are under Trusteeship Council, so that body is now inactive. There are no countries under Trusteeship Council. Lastly, the GATT, the WTO, was founded in 1947, and it is the trade arbiter or trade referee to ensure that trade is kept fair and that you have an agreement on certain tariff and non-tariff barriers, and that the overall atmosphere of trade is one of being collegial, being fair, and making sure that there are certain standards that are maintained in this trade environment. So that's going to do it for today's presentation. It's been a long day for me. This has been very, very exhausting, but I hope you've gotten something out of the videos. Those videos are not readily available on YouTube, but I'm considering uploading those so that you can see the videos in their entirety. There are some very valuable pieces of history that we often don't see in our educational system, but hopefully that they were of some benefit to you in your expanding your worldview. 要感受季风雷手，不管他英雄不英雄，追途不敷衍与不同，也要完美的互动。这一次见面照我的规矩，千万别安静，你没兴趣，我不相信，我听不见你，却能感受你的压抑。